this on to we just have a few introductions. I want to make sure that everybody knows who Christine Keeney is and Linda Raleigh-Thomas, and my awesome co-chair, Julie Blitzen. She's the one that put this together, and it was completely hers and Christine's idea. So take it away, guys.
Okay.
Julie, why don't you go first?
Hi, I'm Julie Blinston. My dog Bert pops in and out right there. I am the vice chair of the EEC, and my role with this committee was to help with parent engagement or parent outreach. So I'm working with Christine to come up with these this IEP IEP 101 series to kind of share more information about the IEP, about 504, kind of, you know, dispel the myths, empower parents by, you know, getting more information. There will be some a link to some downloads and some resources at the end of this. And yeah, so I want to pass it along to Christine.
All right, hello, welcome. We are excited today to be able to talk about IEP basics, and just we understand that we have a very diverse group that's joining us. Some of you may be very new to the process. Some of you may have had children that have gone through and you really understand it well, but it might be, we're hoping that everyone will be able to take a little something from today. And I'm Christine Caney, the Special Needs Liaison, and I'd love to introduce to you our Director of Special Ed, Linda Raleigh-Tom, and she's going to get us started.
Well, hi, everyone. Welcome. As Christine said, I'm Linda Raleigh-Tom, and I have the pleasure of supporting the PTA Special or Exceptional Education Committee and working alongside of both Julie and Monica. And Julie and Monica have done a great job of pulling together a several-part series that we're going to be collaborating on around the IEP process. And Julie shared a little bit about some downloadable resources that she has curated that'll be shared at the end of the presentation, and she's done a great job. And so it's wonderful to be able to kind of get in front of you all today and give you some nuts and bolts about special education. And for the purposes of kind of this part one of the series, we're really going to focus in on the kind of IEP 101 basics. So the presentation's a little dense, but it really sort of covers everything around what is special education and what is an individualized education program. But to kind of start us off, I am going to give you a little bit of information about our district and our special education program. So really, we are, as you know, a large school district. You know, we cover San Ramon, Danville, Alamo, a little tiny bit of Walnut Creek, and a little tiny bit of Pleasanton in terms of our geography. When within that, we have 35 schools and approximately 31,000 students. Right now, we are serving a little over 3,000 special education students. So we're a little under the 10% mark. The 10% mark in terms of a number of special education students to your total enrollment is about the target. That's about the expectation, and a little bit under the statewide average. Statewide average tends to be between 10 and 12% of total population are students with IEPs. So one thing that I always like to say when I am talking with parents is, yes, we're talking special education, but we're really talking about all ed, because first and foremost, and Christine and I will highlight this during the course of our discussion today, first and foremost, special education students are general education students first. So every resource that's available to every student is available to a student with an IEP. And as we talk through working collaboratively with your school site, you know, sometimes it might be, oh, well, that's only for this. The reality is what we offer in terms of all supports to all students really are for every student. And so I like to call it all ed. I really truly believe in that model of education, that we really look to the needs of every child when we're trying to make decisions about instruction and instructional practices. And special education really is there to support those students with identified disabilities who need specialized instruction in order to access the general education program. A little bit more about our district. We are what's considered a single district SELPA, or special education local plan area. That's a huge big acronym. And what it really means is that we are responsible for and have a full continuum of programs for students birth to age 22. So within the state of California, that's how special education services are defined and developed, is within a quote SELPA model. Some districts are not large enough to be able to offer a full continuum of services, infant through adult transition, which is why we're part of a larger SELPA organization of several districts coming together to be able to have that level of service. But we, as a large school district, are able to do that. And so we are a single district SELPA. We do have programs starting at birth. We offer the San Ramon Infant Toddler Early Start Program. It's currently housed at Hidden Hills Elementary. And that program serves students birth to age 3. And we work on supporting students who are primarily low incidence in that program, but are students who have been at birth, have some sort of orthopedic impairment, other physical impairment, deaf or hard of hearing, or are blind. We work very closely with County Children's Health and get referrals straight from the hospital in many situations when we are working with students who are deaf, hard of hearing, or blind, visually impaired, or born orthopedically impaired. We also work with students who at the birth, at the itty bitty level, at the baby level, the eligibility criteria is a little bit different than what we'll talk about in the presentation, but we are really looking at students who have a significant developmental delay at that age. And within the infant program, we focus on infant family services and support. We're really working alongside parents as partners to help understand how best to work with their infant and toddler who has a disability. That's really the purpose of that program. We also run a preschool program, a very robust preschool program for students age 3 to 5. Many of our infants and toddlers will transition into that program once they hit age 3. Many of them will not. Sometimes our early start program is enough to give them the early intervention that they need in order to be successful in preschool and beyond. And for many of our preschoolers, we get those referrals through our regional center of the East Bay. Some of you may be familiar with that program. And we work on, at the preschool program level, again, targeted early intervention around identified needs, with the purpose of getting kids ready to enter school at age 5. Once students do enter school, many of our students in the preschool program do continue, and many of them do not. The purpose of targeted early intervention at the 0 to 5 age range really is to give students what they need and kind of get them ready to go on. And for those students who continue to need additional support, we then transition them to transitional kindergarten or kindergarten, depending on their birth dates and their services required. Every single one of our elementary, middle, and high school sites offers a resource program for those students who require it. We also have related services that are available at our school sites. Sometimes that means you might have one speech therapist at your school site. Sometimes you have part of one who travels between a couple of different school sites. The same goes for occupational therapy and physical therapy. We also offer, it's noted here as AACAT, but it's augmentative alternative communication and assistive technology. And augmentative alternative communication are really services for students who are not able to communicate 100% verbally through typical language models and require more of a total communication program where we provide them with communication tools, sometimes a communication device. And with assistive technology, we're really talking about technology required above and beyond a Chromebook with a Google Chrome platform that might have read or write adaptability in there. But we're talking about students who may require additional technological tools such as a Tobii eye gaze system in order to access their education. In terms of related services, we also offer behavioral support, support to students with visual impairment needs or students who are blind, providing Braille materials and instruction in Braille for our students who will be Braille readers. We also offer what we call O&M, or orientation and mobility, and that again is for our students who are blind and visually impaired. And that service really helps them to learn to physically navigate their environment, both their environment in the community and their environment on a school setting, so that they're able to get to place, from place to place independently. We have deaf, hard of hearing services, as well as psychological services in the form of school-based counseling to address student social emotional needs. We also operate full-day special education programs, we call them special day class programs, and we have several levels of those programs. We offer mild, moderate, intensive, and counseling enriched programs. And within each of those programs, really what defines the difference between them is the level of support that the students require and the type of instruction that the students require. So in the mild special day class program, we're really targeting the general education curriculum and making the appropriate accommodations and modifications to that curriculum so students can continue to operate and progress within the general curriculum, working towards completion of that high school diploma. Within the modern intensive program, we are looking at supporting students' individual needs in functional academics as well as communication. And really we start looking at community-based instruction, helping to support students in really navigating the world around them within the social skills domain as well. Counseling Enriched program is a specialized program for those students that have significant social emotional needs and require counseling throughout their school day. In our Counseling Enriched program, we have daily school psychologist services embedded in that program to support those mental health needs of our students in that program. And then we have an adult transition program, and our students who leave high school with a certificate of completion and go on to our adult transition program are learning how to community and how to get the necessary job skills as well as functional community skills to be as independent as possible as adults at 22. And they're in that program from 18 to 22. So that's a little bit of an overview about sort of the continuum of services that we offer as a school district within San Ramon. But I wanted to also share a little bit about who we are. So within our district department, we are located at the Education Center. We're in the building C in the back in the Educational Services wing. The Educational Services, we are part of Educational Services and the Educational Services team in the Special Education Division. And so in the back of the Education Center is kind of the wing of lovely trailers that have become home to the entire Educational Services team. But Marianne Freitas is our SELPA Executive Director, and she really is charged with overseeing the entire Special Education Division, making sure that we are compliant with CDE regulations and performing the scope and sequence of work that we're required to based on being a single district SELPA. Director of Special Education. So I support Marianne's efforts, but I also work very, very closely in my role with our classified staff. We couldn't do the jobs that we do, and we couldn't support students without our wonderful paraeducator staff. And so I work very closely with classified human resources on staffing and supporting those, our classified staff. I also work very closely with supporting our speech and language and related service providers as well. Amy Capurro is our Assistant Director. She is new to our team this year, and we're so thrilled to have her as part of our team. And she is charged with supporting our mental health supports within the district, our school psychologists, and our behavior team. And so we actually, we do a whole lot more than that, but in general, we really make sure that everything that needs to be happening out at the school sites, we're keeping abreast of, as well as supporting our staffs at the school sites. Specifically supporting our school sites, we have program supervisors. And our program supervisors are district level administrators who are assigned to specific school sites and programs and provide support. And the support that they provide really is to the school site teams who lead the work. Our school site teams lead the EP process and lead the work and really are your front line and your first line of contact should you have any questions. And the program supervisors are there to help them navigate the larger process and to help make sure that one of the things we are required to do as a single district SELPA is to make sure that we're following all the compliance rules from the State Department of Education. So our program supervisors help us in that work, but they also help to navigate the IEP process within the school sites, support program development, and support professional development of teachers and staff. So Stephanie Caparuso, you can read that are there listed next to her is one of our program supervisors, as is David Futterman and Lee Gregory. And we generally try to group programs together as much as possible with a program supervisor. So for example, Stephanie oversees our moderate elementary special day class program. David is overseeing our transition and independent study venture program, as well as supporting some elementary schools, some middle schools and high schools. Lee Gregory oversees our intensive elementary program, as well as supports several middle schools. And she is our newest program supervisor, and we are thrilled and very lucky to have her. Our other program supervisors, Jenny Cordes, a new addition to our team this year as well. She oversees our infant program, and she is tasked with supporting them and supporting our infant to preschool transitions within that program, as well as some elementary schools. And what I will add to this slide later, because I'm noticing it's not here, she also supports our non-public school and county office of education placements. And so she has lots of work that she does with the schools that we send students to that are outside of the district in supporting that program as well. Shelley Levitt supports our mild elementary special day class program, as well as San Ramon High and Vista Grande Elementary. And Carrie Strafacci oversees our preschool program, as well as our counseling enriched programs located at Coyote Creek, Monte Vista, and Los Cerros. Christine Caney is our fabulous special needs liaison. And really the purpose of this role, we've had this role now for, I wanna say almost, I'm trying to do the math in my head, it's about 13 years, 14 years. So we've had it for a very long time, but we developed it as we became a single district SELPA for the sole purpose of having someone who could help families navigate, process, and be a liaison between home and school. And she really is a neutral and confidential resource for families. She provides information and training, but she also helps she listens, she helps build relationships, and she really helps between families and staff in terms of supporting questions that may arise. So the one thing I also wanted to highlight is that while we're not going to, regardless of the IEP process, the I in IEP, as you know, is individualized. But if we think about team, there is no I in team. Team is team. Team is all of us coming together. And truly, you are an integral part of the IEP process. And I recognize that at times it may not seem like you're an integral part of the IEP process. However, we couldn't do what we do without you. You have insight into your child. You know your child best. You are your child's best advocate. And when we can put aside, frankly, all the adults in the room and focus on the student and why we are in the room together. And I know that room right now is virtual, but while we're in that virtual room together and really talk about student need, that's the purpose of an IEP, is to focus on students. And so you help us to provide input into the development of the IEP. Your sharing of your thoughts, your concerns, your goals for your child are vitally important to that development of that IEP. In addition, we do need to have your consent. We do need to have your written consent when we're doing assessment or when we're going to provide services. And really what you help us with as well is help foster that consistency between home and school. In terms of, participation in meetings, we need your participation, and we honestly couldn't do it without. So we appreciate that you are part of that process. So quickly, I'm going to talk about parent rights, and Julie talked about the Google form, the Google folder that she created. And within that is a copy of our current parent rights. But one of the things that happens at every single IEP team meeting, and for those of you that have been working through the IEP process for a long time, you know that this happens every single time, and eventually you probably don't want every paper copy of parent rights, but you of those at the IEP team meeting. And really the basics of those are that we make sure we notify you prior to making any change or doing anything within the IEP document, because we need your consent. We need you to participate in that decision making because we need your insight. We always want to make sure that you're informed of options, and those options should always be discussed at an IEP team meeting. And we want you to provide written consent to assessment. And also you have a right to access the independent educational evaluation process if that's something that you desire because you've disagreed with an assessment that we've completed. You also have that right to access all records. And when you do a student record request within special education, we have 5 business days rather, to turn those back around to you. We also really want to work on settling disputes voluntarily, which is part of the reason we designed the special needs liaison position to begin with, because really it's about, again, the student and really focusing in on the student. However, we also recognize that sometimes we might not be able to completely resolve disputes at the lowest level, and sometimes we need to go to that due process piece. So that's kind of the parent rights in a nutshell. I want to talk just briefly about what an IEP is before I turn it over to Christine for a bit. But an IEP is called an individualized education program. It's a legal document, and it's really truly a written plan that is designed to address the unique needs of a student who qualifies for special education. And there are 13 eligibility categories for special education that are identified in the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. And IDEA really is what governs special education in every state in the United States. It is a federal congressional law, and it tells us exactly how we have to provide supports and services and how the IEP process works. Every single state interprets it differently, and within California, we have our own regulations in regards to how we implement the tenets of IDEA, which is part of what we'll talk to you about today. But really, the sole purpose of that IEP document is to outline what specially designed instruction a student requires in order to meet the goals developed that are based on assessed need and to really access their general education program. There's a couple of tenets in terms of what we kind of call the big ideas within IDEA. And the first one of those big ideas is what we call FAPE. And FAPE stands for Free and Appropriate Public Education. Every student is entitled to a free public education. Students with IEPs and 504s, which we're not going to get into in depth today, but we'll talk about it at a later date. But those students are entitled to what we call a FAPE, that free appropriate public education. Within IDEA, the FAPE definition is different than it is within Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act. And within IDEA and special education, FAPE really means that a student needs what we call specially designed instruction. And specially designed instruction doesn't just mean the teaching component. Specially designed instruction also means related services. So for example, if a student with an orthopedic impairment requires physical therapy support in order to address their goals and then access the general education program and benefit from their program, then physical therapy needs to be provided as part of that specially designed instruction program. We have to meet the unique needs of the student with disabilities. And sometimes you'll probably hear us say that a lot for those of us that work in special education, meeting a student's unique needs. And what that means is we're meeting the assessed needs. We're targeting those areas that are areas of need. We want to celebrate strengths at every IEP team meeting, but the purpose of the written document really is to identify the areas of need and to talk about how we're going to support those so that we can help mitigate those areas of need. Providing related services when required is also really a tenet of that FAPE. As is part of what we do at every IEP meeting is we talk about the relationship to the general education curriculum. We talk about, is the student going to participate in general education? How much time will they be participating, or the percentage of their day? And what does that look like? And are there additional supports required in order to help that student participate fully in education? And those supports can take the form of accommodations and/or modifications. FAPE includes all levels. So we're talking, preschool all the way through secondary, and truly for us, that also means our infant as well. And we also have to make sure that we are procedurally following the tenets of the IDEA. That's where that provided in conformity statement comes from. It means that we are following the procedural compliance components, meaning we need to give you a copy of your parent rights at every IEP team meeting and note that we have. Those are the sorts of things that California has outlined as you need to follow certain steps in terms of your paperwork in order to assure that you have what we consider FAPE. LRE is our other big tenet in terms of special education and what we talk about when we're talking about special education requirements and law. But really what LRE is talking about is we always start from general education. We want to make sure that to the maximum extent appropriate, every single student with an IEP is spending as much time in general education and with their typically developing peers as is possible and appropriate to help them meet their special education goals and to access the general education curriculum. So I won't read this to you. This is how it's read. This is the code in the body of the California statute. But really, if we're looking at LRE, we're really talking about what is it individually determined based on a student's needs. And again, it needs to be talked about at every single IEP. And we need to start from the place of general education first. And so, one of the questions, if you're having an IEP and someone's not really talking in detail about the types of opportunities your child might be getting, one of the questions you might want to ask is, can we talk a little bit more about what it looks like in general education? Or how might my daughter Christine be able to then participate in X? Or what does that look like? But we always want to assume that the general education class is the first choice. Also, what we're talking about with least restrictive environment goes back to that idea of supplementary aids, and that doesn't mean person, it's aids as in tools. So a pair of glasses would be a supplementary aid for me when I drive, for example, but I need that in order to participate out in the world, in order to drive appropriately and not run into anything. But what sort of supports and services might a student require in order to participate in general education? And that is part of what we have to discuss at every IEP team meeting. And you probably aren't going to hear necessarily a team talk about it in this way, but the way in which they're going to talk about it is talking about what does mainstreaming look like, what do accommodations and modifications look like in order to address goals and those sorts of things. But those are discussions that we have at every IEP team meeting. So I'm going to turn it over to Christine to kind of go through the pre-referral process.
All right, so we're going to talk about the pre-referral, and the pre-referral process is, this is an important difference. Actually, all of our school sites have what are called an SST, or a student success team meeting. as an SST meeting can be called by the school or by you as a parent. So if all of a sudden you're starting to notice that your child is struggling and you really want some more information on why, because, you know, from your vantage point, you definitely are seeing it, but you want to make sure that you're bringing it to the attention of the school site. That's a good time to say, you know what, I'd really like to have an SST meeting. And what happens is, this is kind of our pre-referral process where you would bring your concerns to your school site team. They would have an administrator on that team, and they may even have a resource specialist. They may have some general education teachers. They may even have a school psychologist who's part of that team, and they will listen to your concerns, write down pertinent information, and then come up with possibly some interventions or some help and support that they think might help your child, you know, in whatever area that your child's in. Normally what happens is then the SST referral process would continue and meet again in about 2 months to see if some of those interventions are helping. If they're helping, great. Those are general education interventions. Then wonderful. We know that that's helping your child. If for some reason, all of a sudden your child is still continuing to struggle and is stuck, then that's a really great time for that team to talk about a referral to special education service. And that pre-referral process then takes you into the being referred for special education. All right, so the referral process now is, if some of those interventions were not successful, then now you're meeting to continue to talk about, you know, what area does your child need to be assessed in? Does your child have anxiety? Would a school psychologist need to be looked at, you know, would need to consider some of these issues? But in terms of special education, to be referred to in this process, you would have a school psychologist, possibly maybe a speech pathologist if you're concerned about pragmatic language or articulation for your child, and you would need to have a resource specialist. And in that process, then they would meet and assess your child. They would need, again, your parent rights. You would need to sign consent to have this happen. All right, and then this starts timelines. And I know that for many of you, you're very aware of this timeline process. When you ask for a referral to special education and for your child to be assessed, there's 15 calendar days in which that team responds to create, well, here's the information we have of where this child's struggling. These are the people that we need to have assess. And they will create that assessment plan that is then presented to you as a parent or guardian, and needs your signature in order for this assessment to happen. Once that assessment is signed, then there are 60 calendar days in which that assessment must be completed, and a day will be sent, a date for you to attend an IEP meeting. When you're first entering, it's called an IEP eligibility meeting, and that would happen to determine if your child does indeed qualify for special education services. If you, let's say, have just recently moved into our district, then you would have this 30-day timeline would take place. The district has 30 calendar days in which to respond to your IEP from a previous district or a different state. And then the team reconvenes. Where would your child, if you're bringing in an outside IEP, where would your child best be served to as closely match previous IEP as possible? And then a meeting will be held within 30 days to get your consent in terms of placement. All right, and the next piece is the eligibility. So this is determined between looking at the school psychologist. For many of our students, they are going to look at your child's ability and then the resource specialist would look at where your child is currently performing, and you're looking to see if there is a discrepancy between those two. If there is, and if your child would benefit from related services and special education services, then present levels are created. They would look at where your child is currently performing. That would be the baseline. And then after the assessment's complete, you would then have that meeting to determine this is where your child is qualifying. This is the eligibility category that closely matches where your child is struggling the most. Some students have a primary eligibility and some have a secondary. All have for sure a primary eligibility in order to require special education services. All right, an assessment requires, again, it requires your parent input. As Linda shared, as a parent, your input at that and consent is critical in order for this process to continue. You will have this eligibility meeting, IEP, to review all the assessments and any other information that maybe you, the parent, has brought in. Maybe you have a note from a pediatrician. Maybe your child has received some outside services and you have some reports that you would like to share. The team, your IEP team, it's important that they consider any of your outside reports. Now, because they're outside, they have some different, they may have been provided and given to your child in different manners. So they may not be, it may not be like comparing apples to apples, but the team absolutely wants to meet and consider your input and what you've shared. At that point, then collection of other information. You might have the general that's why the general education teachers there, they might want to be able to share some information. Maybe they've already started some other interventions that are helping, that can help guide this practice. And then the written report, the actual, this is part of that IEP where all the assessors put together this report. That's important for you to be really clear about. And oftentimes teams are really great about saying, you know what, if you as the parent maybe don't understand some of that information, please slow them down sometimes to be sure to ask. Because again, you're an integral part of this IEP team meeting. And if you're not really understanding all the information, they want you to understand. So please, sometimes, you know, and it might even be after that initial IEP, maybe so much was going on that you didn't quite understand everything. Please feel free to reach back out and just to share, I didn't really understand this piece, because it's really important that you as the parent understands and processes the information. And again, our best practice is to send this information 5 days prior to your IEP eligibility meeting so that you have ample time to prepare and read all of these documents. All right, now we're going to eligibility. There are 13 eligibility categories, and I won't read all of them, but there are many different ways students can be eligible for special education services. And they are considered by the team. Your input in this discussion is also important. And again, as I said previously, sometimes there's a primary and a secondary eligibility.
So then we get to the IEP team meeting. And as Christine said, at that first IEP team meeting, the purpose of that meeting really is to determine eligibility. That isn't done in advance. That's really done at the IEP team meeting on the basis of all information collected. Now, a school psychologist does need to, as Christine noted, you're going to get a report. And it may be what we call a multidisciplinary team report, where multiple assessors combine one report, or you could get individual reports from each of your assessors on your team. However, the school psychologist will discuss eligibility criteria within the body of their report and their analysis. That's required. California statute requires that we discuss whether or not a child is going to be able to meet those eligibility criteria and list the criteria within the body of the report. And again, it's so that you are adequately informed. And so they actually will be listing that at the end. However, eligibility, as Christine noted, is not just meeting the criteria, but it's also requiring the special education support. And that requiring the special education support is really the purpose of that initial IEP team meeting, to talk about the criteria in terms of how the assessment was completed and what the findings were in terms of meeting criteria and what criteria were met. But it's also really talking about, does the student require then specially designed instruction from special education in order to not only access the general education curriculum, but have what we call educational benefit, meaning be able to make progress within that curriculum and that instruction. So once that meeting comes, you'll get notified, of course. And again, we have several best practices that we ask all of our staff to do. One of them is to send home assessment reports in advance so that you have time to digest it and maybe ask any questions that you have prior to an IEP team meeting. The other one is to involve parents in setting up the IEP meeting itself. So to give some options for dates and time. And then we do send out an invitation or an IEP team meeting notice that basically solidifies the determined and decided upon date. And within that IEP meeting notification, we list the members of the IEP team who will likely be in attendance. At every single IEP meeting, we need to have parents, we need to have a general education teacher, and we need to have a special education teacher, and we need to have what we call an administrator or designee. That is required. Now, in some instances, you as a parent can waive having a general education teacher and excuse them. That is okay. But we do really encourage that participation, and we do really want that participation. But in terms of kind of the roles, you know, the general education teacher is there and your special education teacher. The administrator designee is there to help support what's happening in terms of any needs to help support with that assessment report, as well as are the related service providers who have conducted the assessments are there to help with that as well. We do often have other folks at our IEP team meetings. So if your student is participating in, say, regional center services, often our regional center case manager will attend an IEP team meeting as well. And when appropriate, we include the student. And again, one of our best practices is we begin trying to include students, certainly at the high school level, and many of our middle school teams encourage including students as well, because we're trying to really increase that self-advocacy and support students' independence. But certainly, as we'll talk about later, when we get to the point where we're developing that transition plan with the student, they do need to be part of that IEP team meeting as well. In terms of developing the IEP, yes, it's a written document. I'll tell you, 30 years ago when I started, they were handwritten documents, and we actually wrote most of this stuff in ourselves on three-ply NCR. However, now we have a wonderful IEP management system called SACE, and much of this is already pre-populated for us, so we actually write the specifics related to the student. And so part of what we do is we need to have a statement of eligibility within the body of the IEP document, and we need to talk about how that disability impacts the student. So that's part of the document itself. We also need to have a statement about how much time a student's going to spend in general education and how much time they're going to spend receiving general education. You'll generally see both of those on what we call that FAPE services page in SACE, and it'll talk about the percentages of spending time in general education and special education, along with a statement about how the student's disability impacts them and why they need the support, along with options that are considered. Present levels of performance, that's something that is updated at every single IEP. And what we're talking about with present levels of performance is we're really talking about, based on parent input, based on teacher input, what is at is how the student's currently functioning. So we look at all levels of domains. We look at academics, we look at communication, we're looking at motor, we're looking at health, we're looking at independent skills. And each of those, and within our SACE document, those of you familiar with it, each of those is its own text box essentially. And with each of those, a narrative description of a student's strengths, deficit areas, and educational needs is written. Every IEP needs to really talk about, there's a statement of annual goals. The benchmarks are for students who are participating in the California alternate assessment and are in our moderate and intensive programs in terms of breaking those objectives down or the goals down into smaller chunks. Certainly any student can have benchmarks if within an annual goal, if the IEP team deems appropriate, but for every student who is participating in our alternative assessment process, they do need to have benchmarks associated with those goals. IEPs include service discussion, placement, and recommendations that support those goals. IEPs also include listing of modifications and accommodations along with level of participation in assessments. And at every IEP team meeting, we do need to be talking about how a student, when they're age appropriate for assessments, are going to be participating in not only the statewide assessment program, which is called CASP, but the physical education assessment and some of the other assessments that are required by CDE that all students participate in. At every IEP meeting, we also talk about special factors. IEPs have transition plans if appropriate. And for students where it's appropriate, we talk about transportation and extended school year. Going back and digging a little deeper into what we call present levels of performance. Again, the bulleted piece are really what we want to focus on. We always want to start from an area of student strength. We always want to discuss student strengths in each of our major domain areas. What is it that they're doing well? Where are their areas of real strength? And then how are we going to get them to grow? What are the areas where we see those needs, those educational needs that are really resulted from their disability? And then how does that affect their involvement and progress in general education curriculum and/or appropriate activities? The goals are really talking about how we're going to address those things, but in present levels, you're kind of laying out the story of where the student is. In terms of strengths of the student, again, we always want to start from that place of strength. We want to reflect within the body of our IEP document and within the present levels page itself, which is kind of called the program description summary. We want to reflect the specific skills or behaviors that the student has mastered. We really want to talk about kind of where they are and then what's that jumping off point. We want to talk about how they did well in each of those domain areas, and we also want to take time to identify their interests and their preferences. The big part of present levels is also documenting parent input and concerns. We want you to be active members of your child's IEP team. We want you to help us to know what you're seeing and where your areas of concern are and what you see for your child in the future and what you'd like to work on. It's really essential to document any of those concerns, and it does verify parental participation, but it also helps us to know how to help you be the best possible advocate for your student within the context of the IEP and the homeschool communication setting. We also need to, within the body of an IEP, we need to talk about how we're going to those concerns. Sometimes that means we have to get back to it. Sometimes we have to document in the notes that we're going to have an action plan to get back to a concern because maybe we don't have an answer for it right then. But we need to address those concerns. We can't just let them sit there within the body of the document and not really get back to you about how we're going to support those or have a discussion at the time of the IEP team meeting. Measurable annual goals, then, you'll often hear me say assessment drives goals, drives program. So we gather the assessment data. That data is summarized within the present levels of performance. And then based on that information, we develop measurable annual goals. And those really are things that need to be measurable. So annual goals are really statements within the IEP, and we have a specific goal form within SACE that describe what the child can reasonably be expected to accomplish within the duration of the IEP. So an IEP is written for a year. And yes, we can get together and revise that at any time. But when we're making goals and when we're doing proposed goals and projecting out, we're projecting for a year. That's why we call it an annual review. So we want to think within attainable goals. We want to set kids up for success, again, focusing in on that piece of strength. So part of the discussion at the IEP team meeting is going to be around how do we address the needs, but how do we do it in such a way that we know that we can get the child to that next target, that next benchmark, that next point. And that might mean taking a larger goal that the team says, maybe that might take 2 or 3 years to work on, and breaking it down a little bit and kind of doing a discussion task analysis at an IEP team meeting about what are the component parts and how do we successfully get the child to that next level in order to get them keep moving forward in that positive trajectory. So measurable annual goals, as I said, really are there to address those needs and deficit areas that are within the assessment and defined in the present levels. We need to make sure we're aligning to grade level standards. And when we're talking about aligning to grade level standards, we're talking about the grade level that the student's currently in, even if that goal seems very lofty. But if we think about the way in which our current grade level standards are written, we can pull out the necessary and the pertinent components and do what we call essential standards in terms of what are the essentials components of that grade level standard that the student can reasonably work on and be expected to master and gain success in. We do, again, as I said before, want to write our goals to look at progress over a period of 1 year. But we need to make sure not only that we are meeting to revising that IEP at least annually, at least once a year, but we also want to gather the IEP team back together again if during the course of that year, there is a lack of expected progress. Because part of what we're going to gauge is how the student will progress. And if the student is meeting the target we're setting, we should call an IEP team meeting to discuss that and possibly revise that goal. If a student, many of our students master goals and or benchmarks within the course of that year. And if it's, say, 6 months to the next annual review, we should hold an IEP team meeting to write new goals and adjust it and maybe move on to that next level that we know the student is ready to attain. We need to also meet together to look at goals if we have additional assessment to consider. And if there's additional information that you and the parent provide to us in relation to the goals and things that you're concerned about, or additional information and input that you want to give us in relation to how your child's currently functioning and performing. And again, if there are any other anticipated needs or considerations, we need to call that IEP team together. And the school team can certainly call an IEP team meeting at any time, but you as the parent can also call an IEP team meeting at any time. Yes, we need to meet at least once a year, but that doesn't preclude us from having other IEP team meetings to discuss areas of concern or even to celebrate areas of mastery and strength where we need to adjust things to make sure that the IEP is really aligned with where the student's currently functioning. Lastly, in terms of really measurable annual goals, we want to make sure they're kind of have this component. This is kind of that SMART goal piece. We want to make sure that we have an exact date. What's that time frame of when we expect that goal to be met? Who's going to be working on that goal? That's your student component. What will that student do? That's your goal. We want to make sure that we have what I used to call back in the day when we handwrote IEPs, a given statement. So we say under what conditions or time frame, how is the student going to get there? What are we going to do? What inputs do we need to give instructionally in order to support them getting there? And then what's that measurement, the target or accuracy level? Often you'll see that written as a percentage, but you might also see that written as a number of trials. So for example, 4 out of 5 trials. And then to what level or grade, where are they going to get there? How are they going to do that? Those are all those components that when you break down what the SACE goals look like, those should all be inside that SACE goal. Just to kind of give you a little bit of a summary of what we are required to do within services, our program description summary of our service page in SACE really needs to talk about, when we're talking about, again, once we've got the goals, we're talking about what services a child needs in order to meet those goals and in order to work on those goals. For every single service, we need to talk about the states of the service. When is the service beginning? And then when is the service ending, the duration? Usually that duration is within the regular school year. So for example, if my annual review is going to be next Wednesday, the 27th of January, then my duration for, say, my speech and language support is going to be the following January, but a day before, January 26th. That's going to be my duration, and we're writing it for within a year. That doesn't mean that you can't do services for shorter periods of time. So for example, this might happen quite a bit at our preschool level where we're doing a targeted intervention that is extremely intensive, and we're doing it, say, for a 12-week period of time, that our duration will be a little bit longer. Typically, they're for the regular school year. They cannot go longer. You can't write a duration of service for longer than 1 year, but you could do it for shorter if you're working on something specific. But most frequently, you're going to see those written for the regular school year. We need to define what the location of that is, and that's generally done within the comment section of the goals on our SACE page. And you're talking about where is it going to be. So for example, is your student going to be receiving services within the resource room itself? That would be considered a pull-out program, and you might see that verbiage used. But where is that support and service going to be? And then what is the frequency? So how many minutes per week or month? And yes, some of our services are written yearly and annually. You'll often see that with our less common related services, such as physical therapy or augmentative alternative communication, but we need to define how much time on a regular basis. And that does include supports for talking Christine's going to cover accommodations and modifications for us.
All right. And so talking about accommodations, some of you that are attending with us today, your children may have a 504 plan, and we're going to get into that in more specifics during our series. But this is an issue that definitely you understand well, because on a 504, many accommodations are written to help your child access general education. So let's talk accommodations and modifications quickly. These are also areas that we are going to go into more specifics at another session that we have. But really quickly, an accommodation changes how a student learns the material, and a modification changes what a student is taught or expected to learn. And this is really important. I hear them interchanged a lot, but they're really very different. An accommodation is how your child is accessing general education, and it's just how they're learning. They're still learning the same material. A modification is what. So that does change that access to the general education curriculum. And in this next slide, you'll see, for instance, here's where we would share a student with dyslexia. This is accommodation, might be to listen to an audiobook version of that same book that the general education students are reading at home on their own, but it's the same book. So therefore, another idea is that if a student has trouble focusing, maybe he needs to be seated closer to the teacher or away from a classroom door where kids might be coming in and out. So these are examples of accommodations. And then a modification, this is an example where a student can be assigned maybe very much shorter assignments or homework that's different from the rest of the class. They are not expected to learn the same material as their classmates, but they are expected to learn similar so that they can participate, again, that least restrictive environment as much as possible with their general education peers. All right, and special factors to be considered. Again, these are things that are discussed at every IEP meeting that, you know, you might want some specific behavioral intervention and strategies. Sometimes the school psychologist or the behaviorist can address these. You also want to look at, you know, another special factor is if a student, maybe if English isn't their first language, that might also be a contributing factor. Communication needs, there's also assistive technology. All of these are important pieces.
All right, my mistake. I just stopped sharing and I didn't mean to.
No worries.
I apologize.
And I think the next piece, we're on progress to be reported.
We are on progress monitoring, and I apologize for stopping the share, but let me start with progress reporting. So progress reporting is something that we do on a regular basis. For our secondary students, we report on progress 4 times a year at the same time that their peers are getting, or that progress reports in terms of report cards are going out. And for our elementary students, we report progress twice a year at the semester. Again, at the same time, report cards are coming out. And the purpose of progress reporting is really to explain the extent of how children are progressing on their goals. So the idea is that you are getting a statement of not just a percentage of how they're progressing, but you're also getting a narrative statement of this is what they worked on, this is how it went, here's where we want to head. And they're on their way to meet the goal. The idea behind the progress report is that we're talking about, is your student on their way towards meeting their individualized goals during the course of that annual year? And again, we really want to talk through not just, and we encourage our site teams to not just talk about they did this in 4 or 5 trials on a regular basis, but give us some narrative description of activities that happen and what their progress levels were. In terms, I covered this a little bit, but really progress monitoring is to help us decide whether or not the instructional practices that we're currently using to work on the goals are working well. Because again, as I said before, we want to make sure that our students are going into that positive trajectory. And we want to make sure that they are always heading towards forward progress. If they're not heading towards forward progress, that is a red flag where we want to probably have a conversation about bringing the team back together again to talk about why they're not continuing to head in forward progress. So the purpose, again, really, teachers use it to help guide instructional decisions. We're using it to really help gather information in terms of progress on goals is shared at every IEP team meeting. And when we look at reevaluation of a student at the triennial review mark or the 3-year mark, we utilize that progress on previous goals as part of that analysis of how they're doing. So in terms of looking ahead to that 3-year mark, the triennial review is done every 3 years, and every student in special education is really looked at for reassessment every year. The IEP team discusses it, however. So it is not absolutely required that at every 3-year we do a standardized assessment or another formal assessment. I will tell you as a best practice, when we are what I like to call IRL or in real life, we always like to do make sure that a student's had at least 2 triennial reviews before we really begin to consider doing a file review. Yes, in COVID times, we switched it up a little bit just based on the fact that in terms of following health and safety guidance for many of our students with the 3-year review process, we've been doing file reviews, which are absolutely, if everyone on the IEP team, including you as the parent, agrees, are permissible and often give us enough information. Because the purpose isn't just to reestablish eligibility, but it is also to gather current present levels. So we really want to dig deeper. We're talking about present levels at every annual review, but a triennial review helps us to dig deeper and really see how much progress the child has made in the last 3 years since their last assessment, and where the current areas of need are. So we also really need to have that discussion with you. That's part of what will happen at an IEP team meeting in advance of a triennial review. Often teams will begin this discussion at the annual review preceding the next triennial review, or teams may, call a meeting just to talk about it, or even have an informal conference just to talk it through. But we always want to have that conversation so that you are part of the process in developing that assessment plan and or conducting the file review, as well as providing your consent to any testing that we do. So one of the things, again, is also part of that process within the triennial review is we want to make sure that we're looking at any additional accommodations and or modifications that are required to support the student's IEP, in addition to other areas where we may need to address those within the goals themselves. So that's really the purpose of doing it. And we are looking at eligibility criteria again, but we're really trying to establish where the student currently is and how we might continue to support them going forward. So one thing that happens for every student once they become age 16 is we develop what's called an individualized plan. Once a student hits high school, the idea is that we're really starting to target, and many of our teams target this earlier, and we should be having those conversations earlier in terms of, certainly at the school level, in terms of our goals for the student post high school. We want to start talking about where we see the student once they leave the high school world and go on to post-secondary activities. And post-secondary activities might be looking at participating in job skills, participating in getting a job, working on going into our adult transition program. Post-secondary might be going into a collegiate setting, but we're really beginning to have that conversation. And a piece of that is looking at what are the students' interests. So once a transition plan is developed at age 16, we are looking at that really being the driver of the educational program. Because again, part of our goal is to make students and help students become their own best self-advocate so that they can do the things that thrill them and make them excited about moving on into the adult world. And our goal is to help them with that. So we are looking that by age 15, we want to begin doing interest inventories with students and finding out what are their areas of interest, what are their strengths, and what are they thinking about for themselves for the future. So this is where that vocational domain and that functional life skills domain really begins to come into play. At age 16, by the student's 16th birthday, so sometimes a team will do this in advance of a student's 16th birthday if an IEP is held, say, a month or two before they turn 16. But we have to have a transition plan in place. And what we want to talk about are what are the areas that the student wants to work on and what services are we going to provide in order to support those services. So what college and career readiness activities are we going to be engaging in with the student in order to support their areas of need and their areas of interest. This is also when we really ramp up our interagency partnerships. We really want to make sure that students are taking advantage of things like the Department of Rehabilitation and getting linked up with them, because for our students with IEPs, DOR can really be helpful to them as they enter the adult world. Additionally, if students are supported by regional center in any way, we include them in that discussion as well, because their services and supports are vital once a student enters the adult world as well. When a student turns 17 at the IEP meeting during their 17th year, we need to talk to them about the transfer of educational rights. As a student turns 18, all educational rights do transfer to them as an adult. However, within our system, while we do have students who will then be responsible for signing off on their IEP and being in charge of their IEP, we still notice parents within, we let you know there's an IEP meeting happen, but really it's the student who takes over at that point. For many of our families, they do decide that they want to work through the conservator process at that point. But we need to, by law, by California statute, notify all students that at the age of majority, which is 18, educational rights do transfer to them. And really, in terms of the sort of trajectory of an IEP, your ITP is kind of the last piece. As a student moves on and leaves us, we do what are called post-secondary objectives, where we're talking about what we see for them in the future. And so that's also part of that ITP as well. And that is it for the formal presentation. I think we're probably a little bit over a 45-minute window, but Monica, I'm going to turn it back over to you so that you can get people connected to breakout rooms. And I just want to say thank you so